The middle class is dying. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. But before we unpack exactly why this is happening and how you can escape this cycle, let's first define the middle class, because it's no longer what you think it is. You might not even be considered middle class anymore. You might not have realized it, but the mere definition of the middle class has changed and morphed into something very different. For many years, the term middle class referred to Americans who successfully reached a version of the American dream, having a stable income, a house with a white picket fence, and some sense of financial security for the future. But times have changed. Now, the middle class refers to people who can set up automatic payments to pay off their credit card debt. The definition of the middle class has flipped to the point that owning a home, being financially stable and optimistic, is more of a lofty dream rather than a passage. Nowadays, the middle class is drowning in debt, and instead of facing the reality that they're only a few paychecks away from going bankrupt, they put on a facade and buy expensive clothes, bags, and cars, hoping that their neighbors won't find out the truth, even though their neighbor is going through the exact same thing. The Pew Research Center defines the US middle class as people who earn 2/3 to twice the median household income. In 2018 dollars, this would define the middle class as people whose income ranges from $48,500 to $145,500. If you were under, then you were lower class. If you were above, then you were upper class. That's a big range, and it's quite a bit of money, especially if you're in the upper echelon of it. But still, why does a quarter of American millennials who earn $100,000 a year or more consider themselves to be in the lower class? Why, despite making six figures, is there an expanding subset within the middle class that's living month to month and not being able to save for emergencies or retirement? Is it because they're spoiled kids who don't know how to save, or is there something more sinister going on? Before we uncover the truth of what's really happening, I want to thank our friends at Digit for sponsoring this video. Digit is an app that helps people more easily manage their finances with features like an automated savings tool. Now, Digit has partnered with MetaBank to launch a brand new bank account called Direct, and it's not your traditional bank account either. Although it has your typical features like a debit card, being insured by the FDIC up to $250,000, it's actually much cooler. Direct is an intelligent bank that budgets, saves, and invests for you. But that's not all. It also tells you which of your money is safe to spend so you can spend less time looking at and worrying about your money. After you sign up with Direct, you're set up with 3 separate accounts or buckets called spending, bills, and savings. Of course, you have the flexibility to also create custom buckets to fit your needs. Then, based on your individual financial goals, Digit will automatically move your money into your buckets, automating your entire money management process so that you know what money is safe to spend, your progress towards your custom goals, when your bills have been paid, etc. Ultimately, Direct's goal is to simplify your personal financial life so you can focus on other things, like watching Squid Games on Netflix. If you're interested, you can try Direct free for 30 days, and afterwards, Direct will cost $9.99 per month or $95 annually. If you're interested, sign up for the waitlist to get early access. Link is in the description down below. There are some really interesting data points I want to share with you to prove why the middle class is dying. First is this, mapping out the percentage of US adults in their income tier. Back in 1971, 61% of US adults belonged in the middle class, but as we go through time, the percentage falls to 52% in 2016. The proportion of each future generation belonging to the middle class has fallen too. When baby boomers were in their 20s, 59% of them were considered middle class. When millennials were in their 20s, only 53% were considered middle class. But still, that's not the whole story, because if we look closer at the data, a portion of the middle class actually did join either the lower or upper class. Now, for the lucky few that moved to the latter, that sounds pretty good, right? But the problem arises when we dig deeper and focus in on just this, where a majority of Americans currently are and whose situation is only getting worse. There were some very worrying signs behind the data, and specifically the widening gap between the income tiers. From 2010 to 2016, the middle class's median income in 2016 dollars jumped 6%, from $74,015 to $78,442. In contrast, the upper class saw their median income jump by 9%, and worst of all, in the lower class, only jumping 5%. Now, at the very least, you may be thinking, at least the median income increased for everyone, right? But not necessarily. For this, we need to zoom all the way back to 2000, which would paint a completely different picture. In 2000, the middle class median income was $78,056. In 2016, the median income was $78,442. So that means in 16 years, the median income of the middle class grew by 0.5%. The lower class was even worse off, with their median income actually decreasing by 5%. And the only class that actually saw a jump was the upper class, of about 2.3%. Financial gains for middle-class Americans have been marginal compared to what the upper class has seen, and even worse for the lower class. But that's not all, it's only the beginning. And this is where it gets really interesting. It's not just the income earned that's causing the gap, it's also the actual net worth or wealth that these families have accumulated over the years. And the one triggering event that has made this all much worse goes all the way back to 2008 with the Great Recession. Since the Great Recession, the wealth gap between the upper income and middle income families reached the highest ever recorded. And although the data does show that middle income families did gain wealth in the past few years, it did even come close to making up for the losses that they faced from the recession. In 2016, the median net worth for middle class families was about a third lower of that in 2007. In contrast, upper income families actually saw a 10% higher median net worth than before the recession. So even though the American middle class looks to be stabilizing right now at the lower 50% range, the middle class continues to fall financially behind, not only in median income earned, but also net worth. And this gap is only going to get worse and worse until we understand some of the driving reasons for it and how we can close it. But before we get into the reasons, if you're enjoying this video, I truly appreciate if you could turn that like button into a beautiful black and leave a comment down below what income class do you think you belong to. All this will truly help support the channel. Now, there's no easy way to pinpoint the exact sole reasons for this infection, but there are a couple of reasons that I'm sure that you can agree with, because I don't have a doubt in my mind that you're living with it right now. What if I told you that the paycheck you receive every 2 weeks is a lie? That despite your paycheck being substantially bigger than 40 years ago, your real average income, that is your income after accounting for inflation, barely moved since 1978. And if that's confusing, let me explain. A dollar today is not worth the same as it was a year ago. So in order to compare dollar values from one year to another, you need to take inflation into account. Inflation is simply a decrease in the purchasing power of money, which is generally reflected in the increases in prices of goods and services. And when we account for inflation, that's how we get the term real dollars. Let's say a cheeseburger cost $1 last year, and if nothing else has changed except a 2% inflation rate, then the price is now $1.02 for that cheeseburger. Although it costs more current dollars, that extra 2 cents to buy the cheeseburger due to inflation, it costs the same number of real dollars. But let's completely disregard this fact of real versus current dollars and just focus on the 40 years of wage growth in current dollars. If we do that, then great, right? Everybody's income is increasing and we're all happy. But again, that's only half the picture. If we actually dive deeper into where the wage gains are mostly going to, I bet you 79 cents that you won't believe what's happening. The weekly wage increases since 2000 have been very different depending on what income tier you're in. Weekly wages rose 3% for workers in the lowest 10th percentile. In contrast, workers in the top 10th percentile seen wages grow by 15.7%. Nearly 5 times the weekly earnings of the bottom 10th. In addition to current dollars flowing mostly to the upper class, the second part of the equation makes this whole situation go from bad to terrible. Expenses are also taking up a bigger and bigger portion of the middle class's paychecks, to the point where, here, let me show you. According to the Cost of Thriving Index in 1985, the average major living expenses for a family of 4, including healthcare, including housing, transportation, and education, was around $13,227. The typical male worker needed to work about 30 weeks to cover this cost. But fast forward to 2018, the average major living expenses is now $54,441, and the typical male worker has to work 53 weeks to afford it. And in case you didn't know, there are only 52 weeks in a year. Now, for a typical female worker, it's even worse, where in 2018, they'll need to work 66 weeks to cover the average living expenses. So this means that the reality of the average worker in the United States, they're not even living paycheck to paycheck. In fact, they're actually doing much worse. Before I share how you can specifically escape this cycle, let's first go full circle and go back to the most quintessential benchmark for the middle class, at least before everything completely changed. and that's owning a nice house with a white picket fence. If we look towards the newest generation of potential home buyers, the data shows that millennials are less likely to own their homes than the previous generations. From too much debt, decreasing wages, combined with the reality that median home prices have more than doubled between 2000 and 2020, millennials are finding it very difficult to reach this American dream. One of the biggest obstacles standing in the way is saving enough for the 20% down payment because of this one specific reason. More than 80% of millennials who don't own homes said that they couldn't afford one because of student loans. College tuition has more than doubled since 1970s, bringing the national student debt to $1.5 trillion. So instead of owning homes, building their asset investment portfolio, they're renting, which makes it harder to save, leading them to take on more debt, which is reflected in the income to debt ratio. In the 80s, the income to debt ratio hovered around 0.6, which meant that a household's overall debt was about 60% of their income after taxes. Fast forward to now, the ratio is now just under 1. So a middle-class family making $90,000 has somewhere around $90,000 in debt. And until relatively recently, the majority of that debt would have been mortgage debt. But over the past decade, it started to shift to become student loans. So how can we break this cycle and close the wealth gap? We've been sold the old American dream for decades, that if we work hard, go to college, follow the rules, the system will make sure that we're financially secure for the future. But that's no longer the case. You need to realize that the world has changed. The old definition and narrative of middle class is no longer true. And although it's very challenging to climb to the higher class, it's not impossible. But you'll need to reinvent yourself and take actions. And it all starts with this foundational change that you need to make. In this video, we'll deep dive into how we are psychologically programmed from birth to be poor. And it's not your fault. But once you watch this next video, it's up to you to evaluate your situation and decide if you want to make the change or not. You've been cheated, lied to, and brainwashed. And it's time to move forward and upward.